go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And we're so happy to have you here today. I'm Susan Popko. I am the Associate Provost for International Programs. And thank you so much for joining us for our panel, Moving from Object to Subject, Ethical Photography Abroad. I'm really delighted to have such a terrific group of panelists joining us today, and hope that this is a really valuable discussion for everyone. I wanted to just frame this so you know that this is our winter quarter Global Community Hour. Our Global Community Hours were a program that we started in January of 2017, really to try to bring the community together of students, faculty, and staff to talk about global and intercultural issues. And our fall program focused on teaching and learning across time zones, and we hope you will join us for our spring program on May 13th, which is on racial justice on a global scale. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. This session will be recorded, so please be aware of that. And you might find that your view is easier to kind of see the panelist if you use the speaker view in the top right corner of your screen, and you'll be able to have a focus on who's speaking at the time. In keeping with our conversational goals for our Global Community Hours, I would like to invite everyone to put your questions in the chat at any time throughout the session as ideas come up, and we'll have lots of time for question and answer at the end of the panel. You'll notice that in the chat, we have included a link to the ethical photography guide that we have, and also would like to invite you to take a look at that guide for further resources and to feel free to share that. That's just available on our website. It is my great pleasure now to introduce our panelists. Charles Manser has served as Director of Immersions of the Ignatian Center since August of 2016. His primary responsibilities include the coordination of immersion opportunities, as well as education, formation, and accompaniment of student groups as they explore questions of social justice, simplicity, spirituality, and vocation. Beyond immersions and personal travel, Charles has a rich experience of international engagement opportunities, including teaching in the Federated States of Micronesia and studying on semester at sea. Our second panelist is Maggie Menendez. Maggie is a junior at Santa Clara pursuing an individual studies major on intersectional storytelling. In 2019, she received a Hayes Fellowship and traveled to Udon Thani, Thailand, where she studied photography with a local professional. As both a photographer and a linguist, Maggie has studied 5 languages, and she is especially passionate about building consensual relationships and collaborations with those she photographs. Maggie was our Global Engagement Photo Contest winner this past cycle as well. And our third panelist is Professor Mike Whalen, who is the Knight Ridder San Jose Mercury News Professor in the Communications Department here at Santa Clara. His television experience includes writing, producing, and directing for such hit series as Fox Television's Cops and A&E's Biography. He has produced documentaries for the Discovery Channel, NBC, MTV, and the Learning Channel. Currently, Whalen is directing a documentary series on the history of the American Catholic Church. Whalen runs the SCU Entertainment Industry Group that coordinates student and alumni internships, mentoring opportunities, networking events, and job interviews with the film, television, and music industries. So any students on this panel are probably taking notes of that right now, know who to contact later. But we're going to start out by turning over to our panelists. And I'd like to ask each of our panelists to tell us briefly about your role at SCU and your experience with film and photography. And why don't we ask Mike to start, please?
Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming. Susan, thank you, and Becca for putting this on. I appreciate it. So I have a couple roles at Santa Clara. I'm the chair of the communication department, but I'm also a professor of film. And as part of my research, I don't write books and things like that. I actually make films. And then before I came to Santa Clara, I was a writer, producer, director, as Susan said, in the film and television industry, predominantly television. And with my independent work now and then, I've filmed pretty much probably in every Western European country, Mexico, and in Canada, and then all over the U.S. with various different types of people.
Great. Charles, do you want to jump in, please?
Sure, thanks. And just echoing Mike's gratitude to Susan and Becca for coordinating and having the opportunity to discuss this important topic. But I work in the Ignatian Center, as Susan mentioned in her introduction, and I coordinate the immersion experiences for undergraduate students mostly. And with regards to that, obviously, it's important to many people that on those experiences, we document them via photographs. So in terms of my work with photography, I would say of the group here, I'm the most amateur, just taking pictures in my own travel and just for pleasure. But certainly many considerations which we'll be talking about, given the program that I run and the communities that we work with. The topic of ethical and responsible photography has become a critical piece of the preparation that we have for our students going on these experiences. And then we also we only usually have one camera on our immersions, and students aren't even allowed to have their cell phones. That really gives us the opportunity to focus in on which pictures are most critical to be taking.
Thanks, Charles. And Maggie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Menendez, and like Susan said, I'm a junior here at Santa Clara. I'm an individual studies major. In terms of my experience with photography, I briefly studied photography in high school, really just amateur level, had an interest and a passion for it, but I grew up in a bicultural home, and I have a love for travel as well as a love for languages. So when I kind of picked photography back up in college, I knew I wanted to explore photography abroad. And then the summer after my first year, I was given the Hayes Fellowship through the honors program, and used that to travel to Udon Thani, which is a rural northern region of Thailand, for a photography program, which was super awesome. But it was kind of the first time that I traveled and photographed somewhere where I didn't speak the language. I had never studied the language, and I really had very little knowledge about the culture before kind of being thrown into it. And so that's where I kind of doubled down on the importance of asking permission and started to grapple with all those questions. And that's why I'm here. Thank you all for being here.
Great. So our next question is for Mike and Charles in particular. I know that both of you teach students about photography and film. Can you tell us a bit about the types of choices the person holding the camera may be confronted with in different cultural settings? What are the implications of those choices? And Mike, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Wow, so the different cultural choices that they're going to be facing with are, as many different cultures as you can imagine, are the many different issues that you are going to be faced with. I think that's the first lesson that I want to tell everybody is, like, just because you've done it before somewhere doesn't mean that the new place that you're going, it's going to be the same. People are different, cultures are different. The presence of a camera significantly alters human interaction, period. And when you pick up a camera, you are making a conscious choice about not only what story you want to tell, but how you're going to represent the people or the places or the images that you're going to take a picture of. It's a little bit different. Charles and Maggie will talk to you specifically, really, because they predominantly are taking photographs. And I'm a filmmaker, which adds in a whole other dimension to it when I'm working with students, because it includes sound in ways that regular photographs don't, which can radically alter people's opinions and the way you represent others. And so, like, if I'm first and foremost, what I'm going to tell a student is, why are you telling this story? What perspective are you telling this story from? Right? What are you adding to the knowledge of this story? Like, why is it important? How are you adding something that's new, that's insightful? And then finally, how are you being respectful of the people and the cultures that you're filming? It's really easy for Americans, especially if you're a white male American, to walk in and kind of just like start, clicking away or rolling away in the case of film. And I think you need to stop and ask yourself why. And then ask yourself additionally, what potential outcomes are gonna occur by me taking these images and putting them somewhere and making them public. So I think in a nutshell, to me, it's you have to have a significant amount of reflection before you even start to pick up a camera and shoot something. I'll leave the rest to Charles.
Great, thank you. Okay, great, thanks. Charles.
I'll cover the rest. Mike, that was awesome. I totally resonate with so much of what you shared. And I just wanted to reiterate a couple pieces. I think for me, the most critical questions are what and whose story are you trying to tell, and who really gets to be the architect of that story? I think when we reflect on the title of this talk, that question around objectification and exploitation versus making sure that the subject matter actually is the storyteller. And so being careful to be mindful of that. Obviously, when we're taking pictures that are for our own sort of personal consumption and use to recall a memory, that might be different. And so one of the questions to consider is what you're gonna do with the photographs that you take. And some photographs that you take, you might keep private, others you might share publicly, across the swath of all of your networks. And then some of them you might share privately with a few people. And so different questions come up in each of those contexts. Because of the communities that I work with predominantly, my biggest concern is always, many of you have probably seen the TED Talk around the danger of a single story. I don't want to create a one or two dimensional image of a community, a person, a group of people, simply by taking a snapshot and saying, oh, look at this experience that I've had, and this is representative of their entire lives. And so we have to be mindful of how we create that space for a reflection on, does this story dignify the people that are in the image? And does it actually communicate the story that they want the world to know, or that they want me to know? One of the other pieces that I think is also really critical to consider when you're taking a photograph is, Mikey said this well too, that the presence of having, an instrument in and of itself creates a different dynamic. I would just add to that it creates and often, again, given the communities that I work with that are often quite poor, it creates a very, not just physical barrier, but an economic barrier as well. It's an indication of separation, that when I am in this space with this community, I can afford this object that you probably likely cannot. And I'm using it again as sort of something that is mine to capture something that is yours. And so we have to be mindful, especially when we're traveling to spaces where there are limited economic and financial resources, that we're considering what kind of barriers am I creating. The last thing that I would also just mention, and we sort of joke around, Susan and I were joking around about this in our last meeting, but I'm super guilty of the excessive photo taking, right? Like I wanna document every perfect moment as often as I can. But I'm a little bit hypocritical on this, because when I talk with students about photo taking, especially in international travel, I use like a little phrase that's, be a picture maker rather than a picture taker. And so one of the big questions is taking this photograph actually taking you away from the experience, and diminishing your capacity to stay present and fully engaged in that moment. So I would say those are, for me, the critical questions to consider is, how are you telling a story that's not yours necessarily to tell? How are you not creating barriers so that you can be really with the people, and immersed? And how are you, again, being present to your experience rather than trying to capture it?
And Susan, can I add just one last thing? Because something Charles said, that one of the things I also try to tell young filmmakers, the most powerful films aren't films that come from your perspective, quite frankly. The most powerful, and since I'm predominantly a documentarian, is as a filmmaker is when you can actually turn your film over to your subjects and you give them the voice to tell their own stories. And if you can do that and remove yourself, obviously you can never remove yourself entirely. That pure objectivity is never going to be obtained, but it can be an intent, and that's a huge difference.
I really appreciate how you both have spoken about the intentionality and really engaging with the subjects of photos to make sure that you're engaging in a respectful manner. So how do you navigate getting permission? How do you do it technically when you're working with people? And Maggie, why don't you start us off, please?
Sure. So a big part of this for me is language. As someone who has studied many languages, I have come to the conclusion that there's really no excuse to not learn at least a few phrases if you're in a different country and you're wanting to take pictures so that you can communicate with someone and ask them for permission, and also know kind of to explain what are you going to do with this picture? Who are you? I'm a student. I'm taking this for a class. I'm taking this for a program, and how to say it's okay if you don't want to, so on and so forth. But even I think more importantly in that, I wanted to bring up an interesting conversation that I actually had with Charles at our meeting in preparation for this, where he mentioned that he has actually never gotten a no when asking for permission. And I was shocked because I have gotten no's many, many times, probably half the time in the US and abroad. And so I think that brings up the fact that there is, when you are asking someone for permission, a power structure between you and that person, especially in a setting abroad, that already exists, right? So me, a 5'1", 20-year-old Latin American woman, asking to take someone's picture is a different experience than perhaps a large man asking to take someone's picture. A really good example of this is the National Geographic cover, the really famous one of, her name was Sharbat Gula, I think, and she's in this veil, and it was this amazing cover, right? But a few years ago, it came out that this young 8-year-old girl was terrified of this man who was taking her photo and asking her to take her veil off and so on and so forth. So just remember that even if you are asking for permission, remember that there's already a dynamic there that you have to account for and be accountable for.
I would just add really quickly that, first of all, I just love that I've never been referred to as a large man, so I'm gonna own that. I'm 5'8", so I'm delighted to, on screen, at least appear a little bit larger than that, which is great. But I'll just say really quickly, I totally appreciate Maggie's point and comment there, and agree with it 100%, right? As a whitish looking man in another community from the United States that speaks English fluently, there is a power dynamic that's at play that's different for Maggie potentially, and for other folks, but it's also different in the community. And so, one thing that I'll just add is that asking permission, if you're taking a photograph of, that includes people in it, is necessary, but it's not exactly sufficient in terms of ethical considerations. A lot of cultures and communities, and this is, the piece around communication, people will say yes to please you, and that doesn't necessarily mean, exactly like Maggie's story just communicated about the National Geographic photo, that permission is actually real permission. It could simply be a way to appease this visitor, an act of hospitality, fear, anxiety. And so we do have to be mindful that simply getting a yes does not necessarily give us the automatic permission. And so, I think it's a good start to certainly ask it, but it's not necessarily the be all end all that, yes, they've given me this permission. And so I'm good to go. 3 rules I always tell students when taking photographs is: number 1, ask permission. 2, know the people's names in your photographs, especially if these are people you're intentionally spending time with. And 3, be able to tell a story. Why is this a significant moment? Why is this meaningful? It shouldn't, again, just be this beautiful shot if it doesn't communicate a message or communicate something, again, that the subject matter, that individual or that community or their home might be important for you to recall or for other people to learn as well.
And I totally agree with everything Maggie and Charles are saying, and I'll add the legal aspect of it, because in a lot of my line of work, I legally have to have signed releases to be able to use imagery for any of my work that I'm doing. So if you're going out and you want to shoot something and you want to actually put it on just a social media platform, technically that's publication, that's broadcast. And you should be thinking about the idea of the legal ramifications of reproducing an image and putting it there. So that brings in a litany of different cultural issues, like what is legal consent for us may be something totally and utterly different from country to country to country. Whether a child is able to give legal consent to take a photograph, or whether you need a parent. What happens if you're out on a GSBF, a Global Social Benefit Fellowship Program, where you're actually working with a social entrepreneur who is working with children? Have those parents given permission for those children to be actually part of everything that you're filming? Just because they're part of learning how to become a social entrepreneur and growing coffee in an African country, does that mean that they've given you permission to replicate their image for the purposes of marketing or PR or even just educational for the group that you're making a film for, or taking photographs for a marketing brochure? All of that actually has to be discussed before you pick up a camera. And so, you know, how do you navigate getting permission? The rule I always tell people: the last thing you do is raise the camera. And the first steps are always engaging with the people, developing relationships. If you're working with children, making sure that you're talking to legal adults or legal guardians to know how you're going to interact. And, you know, I'll follow Charles. I'm 5'9", so, you know, but when I show up, I have a film crew with me. And you talk about intimidating. I have a sound person with a big fuzzy thing on the end that kids usually think are wonderful things to play with, and are fascinated with it. And that can be like tacit permission, but it's really not. And then they think TV, and everybody, oh, how wonderful and neat. Well, is it? Do they really want to be on television? Like I said, I spent a year directing cops, so I know what it means to try to get legal permission from people who are handcuffed and high in the back seat of a police car, and whether or not they have the legal or in the legal frame of mind to be able to actually give consent. And so that's, I think, you know, the big rule is the last thing you do is pick up the camera.
Wonderful. So then following up on that, what are some strategies for engaging with subjects in ways that augment their stories and identity? You've talked about the importance of developing that relationship before taking the photo. What are strategies for doing that? And Mike, why don't you start us off, please?
You know, Charles and Maggie have said it all. I mean, I love Maggie's comment of, I mean, you can learn, may I take your photograph, in any language, and heck, you can have it on your phone and just hit play, and it'll play it for you. It's always personal relationships. We're storytellers. I mean, if you're taking a photograph, you're a storyteller, and how can you tell somebody's story if you haven't sat down and broken bread with them? I mean, you know, sit down and have a conversation. Let them get to know you. You know, in interpersonal communication, we talk about the level of intimacy that can be revealed, and it's matched. So if I ask how you're doing and you say, "Oh, I'm fine," I'm probably going to fire back and go, "Oh, I'm fine too." But if I reveal something deeper, something more meaningful, then you will probably reciprocate. It becomes this two-way street. And so how do you navigate? It's the technology it gets in the way. Be a human being. Imagine that you just met this person and you want to become a friend of them. Get to know them and their community. And if you do that, not only will permission come easier when you need permission, but your photographs will be so much more meaningful because you'll understand what to take and why to take it.
It's really powerful. Charles, Maggie, do you want to jump in, please?
Sure. Yeah, I love this question. And, you know, I already touched on sort of three critical pieces. And I love, again, what Maggie and Mike are sharing here, this idea of maybe, you know, you pick up the camera last and maybe ask permission last, right? First, you get to know people, you build those connections. And again, I'll just repeat, I always have folks, know the names of the subjects that they're considering photographing, asking for permission and being able to tell a story. I think the other piece that's sometimes helpful, and again, this is maybe a little bit more limited to the work that I do on these immersions and communities that have limited access to financial resources or other sort of injustices or issues that are problematic, is what story I ask often when we're meeting with folks on immersion, like, what would you like people to know about you? What would you like folks back at Santa Clara or in the United States to know about you? And simply, oftentimes people are really authentic about a question like that and say, oh, we want blank, or we want to be seen as blank. And I think getting a sense of what they want their story to be represented as actually helps you think around the framing, quite literally the framing of an image that you're taking. And so I think that that's a critical piece. I think the other piece too is really asking yourself like if the roles were reversed, what would you feel comfortable with? I shared a story with the group last time we met. I was on immersion in El Salvador, and we were doing homestays in this rural community called Coahuila. And El Salvador actually falls right in the middle of the global index in terms of poverty. And so it's kind of the average point. But for many of our students visiting, it's shockingly poor. And so students are a little bit surprised by that. And obviously an impulse is that they want to take photographs to remember the conditions that they saw. And at one point, a student asked if she could borrow my camera to take a picture of the outhouse. And I said, yeah, sure, but can you tell me why you would like this picture taken? And she had shared, she wanted to take the picture to share with her mom because her mom wouldn't believe what she went through in El Salvador. And for me, that was the moment of, this is people's lives. This is their daily reality. To them, this is normal. It's not okay, but it's normal. And for you to go home and say, look what I was able to survive, it's grossly exploitative of the uniqueness and the dignity of their lived experience, especially when you consider that this is the average point economically. And so I think for her, we had a great conversation, and I'd shared, I'm not comfortable with that. If you had wanted to take the picture so you didn't forget this reality, so that you could hold that and own that and be present to that in solidarity, that's one thing. But how would you feel if someone came into your space and your reality and said, look at how unbelievable this is, in a negative way? And so I think getting that perspective of empathy, I think, is really critical. Is, how would I feel if someone was, if these roles were reversed? And I think for me that is really huge to really represent how people's stories should be told by their own voices.
Yes, I would echo everything that Charles and Mike have said. And it's complicated as a photographer and as a lover of photographs, but the reality is, when you take a photograph, you're inherently flattening someone if it's of a person, right? Because literally a photo can only transmit so much information. And yet, because we know that there was a photographer, a real life person on the other side of that camera, we see a picture and audience members see a photograph and they decide that it's accurate, and because it's accurate, they see it as precise. And so it's really, really easy to see a picture and think that that's all the information it is, and that is a amazing, truthful, precise representation of a person or a community. And that's what makes photography an amazing art form. But I think that's what also makes photography and being a photographer a position of power that you need to be really mindful of. And so sometimes, in my experience at least, that means that if you can't accompany a photo with that story via a caption per se, or a blog post, something, an audio, something that explains that entire story and gives all that information that the photograph inherently has to flatten, then maybe you don't use that photo if you can't provide that extra information. A personal kind of example for me is the photo that I submitted to the university's competition. It's a picture that was honestly really special to me because, again, I spoke no Thai when I spoke to Thailand, when I went to Thailand, none at all. I was terrible at it. But I would practice like these certain phrases that I knew I wanted to learn every day. And if I ever wanted to try and communicate with someone, I would, in my bad accent, attempt. and I was with my host mother, and she was driving me around, and every single day we would pass this one specific woman. And every single day I would think to myself, that woman is beautiful. I wish I could take her photograph. But I never did. I didn't know her, hadn't talked to her, so it felt kind of weird. So I didn't. And then the night before I left, my host mother took me to a local temple to spend the night with like a woman's retreat with her, where I met this woman who I had passed every single day for the last month. I love the phrase that Mike used, breaking bread. And that's kind of what that entire night was. We spent the night there, I slept there. And then the next day she invited me to her home to take her photograph because she knew that I was a photographer. And so that to me is so much more of a story that needs to be communicated, that you can't do that without a caption. You can't do that without an audio. You can't just let that picture be on its own because it doesn't do the person justice.
Maggie, I think that was just such a fantastic concrete example of how to kind of implement these principles that we've been talking about in reality. I wanted to ask all of you again, if you could share a little bit more about particular experiences that you've had when you've had to decide, like, do I take this photo, do I not? And maybe tell us a little bit about experiences that went well, maybe about some experiences that didn't go so well, or changes that you made as you were considering photography through the process. And why don't we start? Maggie, why don't you go ahead and kick us off with this one as well?
For me, I will be the first to admit that if I have the camera on me, I really want to take a picture. If I see someone or something beautiful, I can't help it. I want to take the picture. It's an urge. I have it. I accept that. So for me, a big thing is not bringing the camera certain days. If I don't know the people, if I don't have a relationship yet, you just don't bring the camera, take it completely out of the equation and prepare yourself to just build that relationship. The same thing goes for if I'm, going somewhere that is like culturally sacred, or that I maybe don't even know anything about culturally yet. So I don't know if it's culturally sacred or if it would be appropriate to take pictures. If you don't know yet, just don't bring the camera. That is the easiest way for me personally, because I think it's better to not bring the camera and have to mentally remember than to bring the camera and then take a picture that you don't feel good about after, that you maybe shouldn't have taken, so on and so forth. But I'll let Mike and Charles speak on that a bit more.
Charles, would you like to jump in, please?
Sure. I was sharing with the group, this is my embarrassing story. And, so I did a semester at sea in undergrad. And so for those of you who are, college students on the call, you can appreciate the idea of being abroad for, one of the first times and wanting to have these incredible enriching experiences. And this was before social media. It was like right when the Facebook got started. And so there was very little distribution of photographs. But I had wanted at the time, I was really interested in social justice, and particularly social justice around youth around the world. And so I decided that at the onset of this 10-country-long study abroad program, I would take pictures of children around the world to create a Children of the World calendar, because I wanted to show this to my family and friends and say, we should care about injustice and we should respond to poverty and be agents of social change. I had not in any way, shape, or form considered the dignity of the people involved in these photographs. It was just me as a well-intentioned, ridiculous human saying, I'm gonna do something meaningful with my time abroad. And so I remember by maybe the third country, one of my good friends and I were traveling together, I would find these little, this sounds terrible, but I would find this moment where I saw a kid sitting at a park bench or sitting on a hill, and I'd be sneaking up on them and snapping a picture without any permission, without any exchange of conversation, just to say, this is a child, it's moving, people will be touched by this photo. And at some point, my friend Ryan looked at me and said, Charles, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I had told him this calendar idea. And he's like, that is terribly exploitative and completely disingenuous to the experience of the folks behind the camera. And he's like, what if their parents saw? And again, I had created this very, one-dimensional image of these children. I didn't think about their families or their parents. I thought about tugging at people's heartstrings. So it became about me as the privileged person wanting to make change rather than about them. They became sort of the prop for me to feel better about myself and the change that I was making. And so, I learned quite a bit from that conversation around, thinking carefully about who is behind the photo, and who am I that I get to take this photo right now. One thing that I tell folks that I get really annoyed about sometimes, and forgive me if this is true for the spaces that you inhabit, I get really annoyed if I see, I walk into an office and there's a picture of a bunch of poor brown children or poor brown families without, Maggie, I really appreciate the context setting, right? When there's a caption, it's totally different. But I just see this photograph of someone and I think to myself, 10 years from now, if that child that you depicted in that photo walked into this room and saw that image, what would they feel? What would they think? What is the story that you've captured of them? And is that fair to them? I think for me, when I walk into those spaces and I see those images, they become much more about us and the change that we're making in the world, and the fact that we're wonderful and we care about justice much more than about them and the reality of their lived experience and how that's represented. And so for me, it's, I've made and I continue to make many mistakes when it comes to taking photos, but hopefully it's a conversation where you have the opportunity to engage with others and say, is this good? Is this whole? And is this helpful to the experiences that I'm trying to communicate to others?
I think taking that idea of also understanding your presence and what it's doing to the moment and to the people. I was in Mexico City filming a documentary, and we were using the soccer rivalry between the US and Mexico to kind of try to understand the identity of Mexican Americans. In a nutshell, the film was about like asking the Mexican American, who do you root for, the US team or the Mexican team? And it brought up all these wonderful cultural and familial issues. And so we were down in Mexico because the US and Mexico were playing in a World Cup qualifying game. And if you've ever been to a US-Mexico soccer game, it's pretty passionate. Definitely in Mexico City when there's 110,000 people in a stadium built of cement watching a game. After the game, Mexico had won 2-1. When Mexico wins soccer games, they go to a certain plaza and celebrate. This plaza happens to be why the US did this, I have no idea. The hotel where the US team was staying was on the same plaza. And we were in the crowd filming and getting their reaction, and it was fun and they were having a great time. And the Mexican fans were coming up to the camera. I had a press jacket on so that they knew who I was. And it was all fun and games. They were celebrating. They had beaten their biggest rival in many things, not just soccer, 2-1. And as we start moving towards the hotel, there became more of a kind of angry back and forth between the American fans and in the hotel and the Mexican fans that had gathered, quite honestly, to celebrate. And it started turning ugly. And we were filming, and then at that time, some local little boys, probably between the age of 5 and 8 or so, saw the camera and wanted to look at the imagery as I was filming, and so they could see my viewfinder and see all the stuff. But bottles started being thrown and crashing above my head. And more kids were being drawn. Once 1 or 2 started looking at things, more started coming, and then the crowd started noticing a camera and wanted to play to the camera, which was mean more bottles. And that's at the point where I shut the camera off, even though for my film that was perfect. That was a great, and I was not fearful of. I've been in far more dangerous situations as a cameraman, and with no issues. But I realized I was drawing a crowd and I was influencing the moment. My presence was altering what was happening, and for the negative. And so I turned the camera down and put it off and went into the hotel, into the lobby. And nicely, the little boys all followed me, and then I just set up the camera and they watched, because they could just sit there and watch the fans jumping up and down, and it got them out of harm's way too. So I think you have to understand, and you have to be able to kind of get, it's out of body, be able to look down and go, what is my presence doing here? And there's times when your presence is negatively impacting people and the moment, and you should not film. And it goes to, you know, what Maggie said about, I mean, I'm sure those photographs of that woman in Maggie in her own home after having developed a relationship with Maggie are probably stunning. And they're so much more informative because of that. So it's just, you know, there's times when you have to understand when to not shoot, you know, when to turn it off.
Can I just add really quickly to that? That Mike, that is such a good story, and this happens frequently. Anytime, again, if you're in a space that looks very different from your own, or you're a standout person, even without a camera, you're interrupting, right? And so being mindful of how that interruption is affecting the lived moment. The one other thing that I would add is, you know, just to again refer to the document that Susan shared at the beginning around the considerations that one should think about when taking an ethical photograph. One thing that we often forget is the impact of taking the photograph on ourselves and our ability to live in that space. I was sharing with the group last time, you know, I was with a group of students in Tanzania on safari, and you know, we finally had this epic moment where this rhino, which is really rare, and my mom used to work at the zoo growing up, and so I love rhinos. I was like, this is it, it's happening. And my entire attention in that time was focused on getting the perfect photograph. And I think I must have took like 300 photos of this one rhino. And by the time this moment was over, I didn't even enjoy the rhino because I was so fixated on trying to get the perfect image that I realized, oh, I missed this opportunity. You know, and that sort of harkens to Maggie's point around, like, sometimes just leave the camera behind and enjoy, right? Enjoy being present and living in the space, because then you get a memory rather than a photograph. And so I think for me, that's a big consideration as well, is sometimes not taking the picture focuses your attention, and it forces you to say, this is my moment in this now, in this here and now, that I don't have to set up any other way than what's currently exhibited here. And so that's the only other thing that I would add. And I am, again, I'm saying this as the guilty party, like, I want the photo, but in reality, it inhibits my capacity to really enjoy it sometimes.
And Charles, I just have to add, since you have a rhino story, I was in Yosemite, and I was probably 18 or 19 years old. So I'm shooting on film. But I had an auto winder on it, and we're walking, and we sat down on a tree on the side of the trail to grab a drink of water in the high country. And all of a sudden I see my two mates who were with me running down the hill. And I look up, and there's a bear coming down the path. And of course my instinct is, oh, I'm gonna take a photo. Well, I pissed the bear off because she heard the camera and reared up on her legs. And I realized, okay, this photo is not worth being mauled by a mama bear. And then I ran. And then a mile down the path, we saw a ranger who said, oh, by the way, there's a bear, and she's protecting her cubs. Don't mess with her. And I was just kind of like, yeah, sorry.
Those are very powerful stories. and you're right? It's that, you know, the question about being taken out of the moment, it applies as much to wildlife or to nature as it does to people as well. It really kind of questions, what is your goal for being in that moment? How do you experience life? We've shared a lot of really fantastic thinking and advice around considerations, taking the photo and filming. Can you panelists say a little bit more about how we should consider how an image is shared and used? So that after you have the image, what do you do with it? What are some ethical considerations for different ways that an image is disseminated? And Charles, why don't we start with you, please?
Yeah, Susan, this is something that we've thought about a lot, because we have to market, right, to get students to register for our programming. And so, you know, questions around what is the most attractive imaging to get students on board. And the temptation is exactly what I said it shouldn't be. It's to showcase acts of service and justice, because that moves people. It's compelling. And you know, we've come to the conclusion that that's inappropriate. If our goal is solidarity, if our goal is, you know, relationship building, then exploiting like even in imaging is problematic. And so one thing that I always say is that, you know, you might take lots of pictures that are intimate and personal to you and meaningful and enriched, but you don't need to share all of them. And so being careful with selecting who the audience is that you intend to share the photos with is critical. And so, you know, again, I'll point back to that ethical photo guide. You know, you might be with your host family taking pictures with the kids because kids love photos, right? This sort of, I hesitate to say it's universal, but in my experience so far in travel, there's not been a place that I've been that kids don't want to be like taking pictures and in pictures and selfies and looking back at the screen. And so maybe you take those pictures because it's rude not to. But those are pictures that you keep or you delete. And, or maybe you share with, you know, your family or your close friends, and you explain the context of what was happening in those pictures, but that's as far as it goes. And then maybe you curate a few photos that you share publicly. And, you know, to Maggie's point, you give a caption and a story. I think the one danger with the caption and the story is that people might disregard it and just ignore that and look at the image and still come up with their own conclusions. I've seen this time and time again where, you know, someone posts a picture on Facebook or Instagram, and then you read the comments that flow below that. And those comments are, for me, like, oh gosh, that's actually not what I was trying to portray. And so I've kind of gotten in the habit, especially on my immersion experiences, of not posting pictures of people online, unless it's with a specific group that I, you know and trust is actually interested in knowing the story rather than my perspective on this story. So again, you might take a lot of pictures and you might not share all of them, and you might curate what gets shared and how you explain it depending on the audience or the context.
Mike, Maggie, what else can you share with us?
I mean, I would just echo everything that Charles said and also circle back to what I had said before about how, yeah, if you can't provide that context somehow, maybe don't put it up, and just keep in mind that it's one decision and one process of decision making to decide, should I be photographing this moment? And then it's a whole other decision making process to decide, should I be using this? Should I be using this for this? Should I not be? And I also would say that it's okay to like have a growth mindset about it, right? Because I think I have definitely put pictures on perhaps like my photography website, and then I think I actually don't know enough about this person to be posting this, and you take it down. And I think that's okay to have that growth mindset and understand that you will continue to grow and understand better like what those ethical considerations are and how to I don't know, how to interact ethically with the people in your photographs or even the places, because even though a landscape seems super harmless, sometimes we like really take landscape photography as like this apolitical thing, and yet we also need to be careful of how we're portraying certain natural resources and areas that were not ours to begin with, so on and so forth. So I think just always remembering and asking yourself, why are you sharing this? Whose voice is it? And am I reinforcing any specific narratives? Which narratives are those?
I would add like disable comments on social media sites. When my films are posted on a site for people to watch, I disable comments. I find anonymous commenting to be a horrible thing in general. And even people who are willing to put their name to some comments. So, and if you're putting a picture on because you want to get a bunch of people to comment on it, you're doing the wrong thing. That's not the reason why you should be doing it. So to everything Charles and Maggie said, absolutely yes. And I would add, you know, if like social media is just a horribly terrible thing to in general. I'm sorry, it's not. I mean, photographs are meant to be shared, but like with Maggie's work is, I would go to her show, you know, and I would see 10 to 12 photographs which are telling a story, a narrative story between them. And then outside of that, a photograph from what Charles said is, you know, of your host family, of the kids. That's for your personal memories. That's for your scrapbook. That's so that you can open it up and tell stories. And again, you're adding the context when you're telling that story. So to me, the idea of just posting because you want likes or comments is just the wrong thing to do.
It's really, really helpful and thoughtful advice. Thank you. We have time in our panel now for some questions and answers. And so if you have something you'd like to raise, please go ahead and put it in the chat now. We did receive a couple of questions, and so I'll go ahead and we can turn it over to the panelists to begin answering those. So the first question is, how would you engage in conversation with a person who is not engaging in ethical photography, whether in the US or abroad? What do you do if you see someone not doing it right? How do you respond to that? And any of our panelists can feel free to jump in.
Go ahead,
I can get
Charles.
us started. Yeah, I saw we unmuted at the same time, but I would just quickly say, for me, I like to poke fun at myself and share stories of times that I have made mistakes. And I love Maggie's point about having the growth mindset. Just say, I'm not perfect at this. These are some considerations I've gone through. Are they helpful for us to talk through together? I think for me that's the reason I have been more mindful is because of those conversations that other people have brought to me. And so giving myself the opportunity to share those and make fun of my own sort of growth and continued learning, I think is always a helpful way to start.
And that's why Charles runs immersions with students and I don't. Because from a professional context, I step in front of the guy shooting the camera and look at him and just say, what are you doing? I've done that before. People on my crew, I walk around, I just step inside, huh? Because if I do that, they can't, I block in their frame. And so, but that's in a professional realm. If I'm working with students, it's going to be hopefully more along Charles's avenue.
I would just add that I think questions are always a really good place to start. I don't think anyone enjoys being lectured. I think asking someone a question so that they can start to maybe consider things that they haven't considered, at least when I've been on the other side, that's what I have most appreciated, is just being asked questions that perhaps I didn't think about, that I should have been thinking about. Yeah, but I didn't. And so having someone bring that up should never really be a negative thing.
Thank you. So a second question that came in is, have you ever had to ask someone to take for permission to take pictures of them? And you've shared some examples of how you've encountered that in your own experience in the past, but can you give us a specific script? How did you go about navigating the uncomfortableness of that conversation with someone?
I'll go back to Mexico City. We wanted to get some music. And there was a wonderful band playing at a square in the evening in a much smaller town outside of Mexico City. And I just loved the music and I wanted to film some of it. And I thought it would be a great backdrop to tell the story of this city. And I asked somebody, what are they playing? And they said, oh, this is a folk song from this town. And without the camera, I myself, and I had a crew of 5 people with me, I myself sat there, listened to them play the whole thing. They took a break. And then I just walked up to them and I explained who I was and the film that I was making, and that one of the players that we were profiling is from this town. And that was a beautiful song. And I was wondering if I could record it. And they were wonderfully receptive to it. And let me record it. They asked before, they said, well, could you give us a copy of it? Because we would love to be able to have it for ourselves. And now I'm working in a digital realm. And I said, yeah, absolutely. It's easy. I can do that. No problem. We exchanged, I told them what hotel I was staying at. We ended up having dinner with the band, because it became meaningful for both of us.
Great, thank you. Don't have any additional questions in the chat. So, and we're just coming to the end of our session. With the last couple of minutes that we have left, I wanted to ask each of our panelists to just share a top tip for those who want to ensure they're engaging with individuals and communities in the most responsible way. And Mike, maybe you can start us off.
Wow, it's Charles and Maggie have said it too, and to me, it's why. Why take that photo? And I like Charles's idea of think about the person or place that you're taking it in 20 years, seeing that photo. So to me, it's just, instead of just shooting, it's really easy in the digital realm to just shoot and shoot and shoot and shoot because it doesn't cost you any money, so to speak. So just ask yourself before you shoot why.
Yeah, I would add to that why the word collaboration is huge for me. I think I love taking pictures of people. That's like my passion, right? And unless I am paying a model, to me that means it needs to be a collaboration between both. And so maybe that means that you're asking them, how do you want to be photographed, or what do you want me to say in the caption, like someone else mentioned earlier. Just I always come back to that word collaboration, because if it's not a collaboration, I think something's off, and that's a really simple way to think about it. That definitely isn't all encompassing, but a good place to start, I would say.
I'll add one quick thing and then one slightly quick thing. The first is, to the point of permission, I think sometimes just sharing the picture with the person is helpful to reaffirm permission, to say, oh, this is the image. And if they're very pleased with it, and they give it the thumbs up with a smile, you have a better sense that that real permission is there, that it's not just, again, about you. It's exactly like Maggie's saying, a collaboration. The second thing that I would say, and I've already said this, but I just want to reiterate, is just do the role reversal and say, would I be comfortable? Would my parents be comfortable? Would I be comfortable if my child was in this particular moment and someone was capturing it? And if not, that should communicate something, that there's probably a potential issue here.
And that is a wonderful way to close our panel for today. I want to thank our panelists, Charles Mansour, Mike Whalen, Maggie Menendez, for their expertise and their time and sharing generously of their life anecdotes and stories today, which was really fantastic. We appreciate all of you joining us. Want to invite you to mark your calendars now for our Spring Global Community Hour on May 13th. And thank you all for being part of our program today. Have a good day, everyone.